This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous, because what just happened looked like control. It looked fast, efficient, decisive, but that's not what power is anymore. Power now depends on something fragile, something invisible, something that can't be seized, blockaded, or forced at gunpoint. And when that thing breaks, nothing else works the way you expect. Not markets, not alliances, not the future you're planning for. You were told this was a show of strength. You were told this proved dominance still matters. But if you look closely, this wasn't strength. It was a stress test. And the system didn't pass. Stay with me. Because what failed here doesn't stay far away. And the next part is where the illusion really starts to crack. Underneath the spectacle, something else is running the system now. Not ideology, not elections, not even military force. What controls outcomes is credibility over time. The belief that tomorrow will look enough like today for decisions to make sense, for contracts to matter, for capital to stay put, and that belief is what was put at risk. Because the move you just watched wasn't about territory. It wasn't even about oil. It was about demonstrating that rules can be suspended instantly, that agreements can be rewritten mid-sentence. That power no longer needs continuity to act. That feels decisive. Until you realize who the real audience is. Not voters, not adversaries. Markets, companies whose entire business depends on knowing whether today's promise survives tomorrow's mood. When that question becomes unanswerable, control quietly changes hands. And the next part is where we see when that shift actually began, not with a crisis, but with something much slower. What makes this dangerous is not how fast it happened. It's how long it's been happening without being named. There was a time when power moved slowly, when decisions survived administrations, when businesses assumed that chaos was the exception, not the baseline. Before, volatility was episodic. A war, a crash, a scandal. Then things settled. Now volatility is structural. Now, the assumption is reversal, that any deal can be temporary. Any partner provisional, any rule subject to deletion. And because this shift was gradual, it felt normal. Each step small enough to rationalize, each break explained as unique. But systems don't collapse all at once. They hollow out. The most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They normalize. They teach everyone to shorten their time horizon. When long-term thinking disappears, nothing visibly breaks at first. It just stops being built. And that's where the first real shock enters the story. Not as an accident, but as proof. What happened next looked like a crisis. But it wasn't the story. It was the symptom. A government removed in days. Oil assets declared up for control. Tankers blocked. Revenue frozen. On paper, it was flawless. No invasion, no occupation. Just pressure applied at exactly the right points. Markets reacted instantly. Stocks jumped. Headlines followed. This was supposed to be the proof. That power, applied efficiently, still works. But then something unexpected happened. The companies didn't rush in. They paused. They looked at the numbers, the history, the risk, and they quietly understood something the spectacle tried to hide. This wasn't stability. It was improvisation. They had seen assets seized before, contracts rewritten before, assurances laughed off before. And this time, there were no guarantees, no protection beyond the moment, no promise that today's rules would exist tomorrow. So instead of commitment, there was hesitation, careful language, non-answers. If you're finding this unsettling, stay with me. Because the real danger isn't the shock itself. It's what this hesitation reveals. And that's where the mechanism finally comes into view. This is where the system reveals itself. Because coercion can force action, but it cannot force belief. What actually makes large systems work is not fear. It's predictability. Investment only happens when losses are limited, timelines are clear, and authority outlives personalities. That's the hidden mechanism. When a state shows it can tear up agreements instantly, when it signals that legitimacy is optional, it transfers risk downward, not to governments, to companies, to workers, to anyone who has to commit capital before seeing returns. The people issuing commands absorb none of that risk. They move on. The damage stays behind. That's why the response wasn't defiance. It was delay. Yes, if only this obstacle were removed. Yes, once the situation stabilizes. Yes, but not yet. That's not resistance. That's capital quietly refusing to cooperate. Because once unpredictability becomes policy, every future deal is discounted. Every promise is shorter. Every system becomes brittle. And brittle systems don't fail loudly at first. They fail by slowing, which is why the next moment matters so much. Because when speed is demanded from a system built on patience, something snaps. Everything accelerates here. Deadlines appear. Pressure increases. Expectations compress. The demand is immediate action, immediate results, immediate proof that this worked. But infrastructure doesn't move on command. Pipelines don't care about speeches. Refineries don't respond to urgency. Money is asked to arrive now, returns are promised later, and stability is assumed in between. That gap is where systems break. Because while public power can move overnight, private capital moves on confidence. And confidence was already eroding. Executives start asking questions out loud. Who guarantees this? For how long? What happens when leadership changes? Who pays when the rules change again? There are no answers, only reassurances, only laughter, only insistence. So timelines stretch, commitments shrink, plans quietly stall. This is no longer about one country. It's about whether long-term investment is possible at all under conditions like this. And once that question is asked, it doesn't stay contained, because the same logic applies everywhere. Which brings it home. This is the part that reaches you. Because when systems lose continuity, they don't fail in boardrooms first. They fail in ordinary lives. You feel it as hesitation, as prices that don't make sense, as jobs that don't quite materialize, as investments that pull back without explanation. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just a narrowing. Long-term plans become short-term contracts. Stability becomes conditional. Risk gets pushed downward until it lands on people who can't hedge it, on you. When capital stops trusting the future, it stops building it. And when that happens, growth doesn't collapse. It thins. Opportunities arrive later. Payoffs shrink. Margins tighten. You are told this is temporary, that things will settle, that strength is being restored. But notice the pattern. The delays, the cautious language, the quiet retreat from commitment. If this matters to you, stay here, because the consequences don't announce themselves all at once. And the next part shows how quickly this kind of instability spreads, far beyond where it started. What breaks in one place doesn't stay there, because systems like this are connected by expectation. When rules are shown to be reversible, other governments take note. Other investors adjust. Other deals quietly change terms, not in protest, in precaution. Partners begin to hedge. Allies diversify. Contracts grow shorter. Guarantees get written in pencil. This is how instability globalizes. Not through panic, but through calculation. Capital starts asking the same question everywhere. If agreements can be torn up here, why not somewhere else? Supply chains reroute, energy flows shift, risk premiums rise, and no one announces it because it's rational. It's defensive. The world doesn't wait to see if this becomes permanent. It acts as if it might. That's the ripple. Once that logic spreads, restoring trust is no longer a domestic decision. It becomes a negotiation with everyone watching, and now we're standing at the edge of what comes next. Because from here, there are only a few possible directions forward. And none of them are simple. From here, the future splits, not into certainty, into paths. The first is adjustment. Rules harden, timelines lengthen. Continuity is restored just enough for trust to return. Not because anyone apologizes, but because systems demand it to function at all. The second is erosion. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. Power still acts. Markets still move, but every deal carries a discount. Every promise expires sooner. Growth slows without ever quite stopping. The cost is permanent, and it's easy to miss. The third is rupture, where unpredictability compounds, where reversals trigger retaliation, where capital stops waiting and starts exiting. Not dramatically, systematically. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They look identical at the beginning. Small decisions, reasonable hedges, temporary measures. That's what makes this moment dangerous. Because the future doesn't hinge on intent. It hinges on whether continuity is rebuilt fast enough. And we don't yet know which path we're on. That judgment comes last. This doesn't end with resolution. Because systems like this don't fail in a single moment. They drift, they thin, they become less reliable without ever declaring themselves broken. What you just watched wasn't a conclusion. It was a warning signal, a demonstration of how quickly force can replace trust and how much weaker power becomes when it does. Nothing here guarantees collapse. Nothing guarantees correction either. What matters is what happens next. Whether continuity is rebuilt quietly, or whether volatility becomes the permanent price of influence. If this felt unsettling, that's not accidental, because the danger isn't spectacle, it's normalization. If unpredictability becomes expected, then instability becomes rational. And once that logic sets in, it doesn't reverse easily. So don't look away yet. Don't assume this chapter is closed. It isn't, because the next test won't look like this one. And by the time it's obvious, the system may already be operating on different rules. If you want to understand where this goes and what to watch for next, stay with me. This story is still unfolding.